Ukraine has pioneered many uses for drones when battling President Vladimir Putin's troops. It's come up with ways to use drones to strike deep into Russia's territory as well as take out parts of the country's dreaded Black Sea fleet. But on the ground, it's a different story. Drones still play a huge role, of course, but one of the most surprising things about the war is that Ukraine has gone back in time to the days of trench warfare to inflict massive casualties on Russia. Putin's soldiers are falling like dominoes to Ukraine's brutal World War I-style fighting, meaning that Putin has a serious problem. You wouldn't know this if you focused solely on the talk about Ukraine's innovations. Drone innovation has been the main focus of many media outlets during the war. As Chatham House says, throughout the war, Ukraine has proven especially adept at using relatively low-cost and lower-tech solutions to counter Russia's larger numbers and deeper resources. It has pushed the envelope on drone innovation to counter Russia's own, well-financed drone operations. It's not wrong, and Ukraine knows it. It's why Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky announced his country's intention to build 4.5 million drones in 2025 alone. Ukraine is also signing drone-related deals with its allies. On July 6th, Ukraine announced that it had signed a deal with a leading US defense company, which is currently unnamed, that will allow it to co-produce drones with American help. That deal adds to others Ukraine has made with its European partners, including one with Denmark, that will allow Ukraine to produce drones on Danish soil. Drones are important to Ukraine, but they're not the only weapon Ukraine has in its arsenal. What we're now seeing on the battlefield is Ukraine creating a unique blend of defensive measures that see it combine its drones and other cyber warfare innovations with a strategy that's over a century old: trench warfare. Ukraine has dipped into the World War I playbook and come up with trenches that, when combined with its drones and other innovations, are inflicting massive casualties on Putin's forces. That's according to UK military expert Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. He spoke to Times Radio on July 5th to explain how Ukraine is relying on a World War I-era tactic to cause massive damage to Russia. The host of the show points out that much of the discourse relating to the Ukraine war focuses on the tech side. We keep hearing from our politicians and our senior officers that warfare has now moved into cyber and is all pushing buttons and using technology. It can't be like that on the front line, is it? The interviewer asks. De Bretton-Gordon says it's a combination of the two. I think there might be a bit of both, but you're absolutely right, he says when speaking about Ukraine's trench warfare strategy. The trench warfare and the casualty rates are not dissimilar to Passchendaele and other great battles in the First World War. In other words, the more war changes, the more it seems to stay the same. Though Ukraine has rightly innovated on the drone front, it's also had to deal with Putin's strategy, which is to conduct a ground-based war of attrition that hopes Russia will overwhelm Ukraine. Putin's goal is simple: outlast Ukraine at the cost of hundreds of thousands of Russian lives. More people win the day in Putin's mind, and drones alone simply aren't enough to inflict the level of casualties Ukraine needs to keep Russia's marauding forces at bay. Trench warfare combined with those drones is the answer Ukraine has come up with, and it's working. The Russians ghosted through 1 million casualties a few weeks ago, de Bretton-Gordon points out. When you think that Britain lost 345,000 casualties in the Second World War in 6 years, it really puts it into perspective. And the MED intelligence update, I think last week, was saying that the Russians are still losing 1,000 soldiers a day on the front line. Those figures seem to be accurate, and we only need to look at 4 days in July to see that Russia's casualty rate is massive. On July 4th, says RBC Ukraine, Russia lost 1,120 of its soldiers to death, injury, or capture. Pravda reports that Putin lost more than 1,050 soldiers on July 5th, with RBC Ukraine noting that the number was 1,180 on July 6th and 1,100 on July 7th. What we have here is a war of attrition, with Russia being the biggest loser. Every day, Putin sends his troops into the slaughter. He knows that Ukraine's trenches are the reason why there are so many deaths, but Putin doesn't care. He's using Russia's soldiers to whittle away at Ukraine's defenses, to drain their ammunition stockpiles. In Putin's mind, the best way to deal with Ukraine's new version of trench warfare is to exhaust his enemy's resources with bodies until they're forced to abandon their trenches. Well, that's one of Putin's tactics. We'll get to another thing he's done to counter Ukraine's trenches in a moment. For now, Ukraine's trenches appear to be working. If we take the 4 figures we just mentioned, we get an average of 1,112.5 Russian troops being lost per day in 2025. Stretch that out for the entirety of the year, and that will leave Putin with an annual casualty rate of a little over 406,000. Bear in mind what de Bretton-Gordon said about the UK's casualty rate during the entirety of the Second World War, being around 350,000. Russia is losing more than that per year thanks to Ukraine's unique blend of trench and drone warfare. Putin's troops are falling like dominoes to Ukraine's trench tactics. And right now, that's all part of the plan. That's according to Ukraine's army commander-in-chief Oleksandr Syrskyi, who says that Ukraine has been shifting its tactics on the front lines in recent months. It's had to as Russia adapts its own tactics to launch more numerous assaults with smaller numbers of troops dedicated to each. Now we see that the most effective position is a maximum one of detachment, and these are mainly groups of trenches, even so-called foxholes, which make it impossible for the enemy to use strike drones. After all, now a drone, especially on fiber optics, can penetrate any hole, Syrskyi said toward the end of June. Here we see a shift in how Ukraine is using its trenches. In the past, Politico says, Ukraine created strongpoints that included trenches up to 3 miles in length. That's not the case anymore. Now Ukraine is building networks of much smaller strongpoints, using trenches of around 220 feet in length, along with anti-drone measures to protect the troops inside. Ukraine's defense minister Rustem Umerov explains that this is necessary. These are harder to detect and are effective in carrying out tasks of defense, deterrence, and delivering firepower, including against FPV drones, Umerov claimed when explaining Ukraine's shifting strategy. But whether it's large or small trenches, the basics of trench warfare remain the same. At its core, trench warfare is a simple concept. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines it as a form of warfare in which opposing armed forces build relatively permanent systems of trenches, which are dug into the ground. These trenches are typically fairly close to one another, often within firing range, and there will be a no man's land between them into which neither side wishes to enter, but enter they must. To make advances in trench warfare, one side must leave their trench to attack the other, crossing the gap in between while under enemy fire. At least that's the traditional version of trench warfare. And while that version still exists in Ukraine, both Russia and Ukraine have to account for the presence of drones on the battlefield. That's why Ukraine's trenches, at least, include anti-drone measures. Rather than sending people into no man's land, both sides can send expendable drones capable of doing just as much, if not more damage as a human without any of the casualty costs. That's what Ukraine is doing. Russia, not so much. While it's using drones, as Ukraine points out, unmanned vehicles can't complete territorial advances. You need people for that, which is where the high casualty rates we mentioned earlier come into play. Ukraine is defending. The onus is on Russia to make advances from its trenches, and whenever it tries, scores of its troops get cut down by Ukrainian fire. Ukraine is investing heavily in this World War I tactic. On July 6th, Euromaidan Press reported that the past year has seen Ukraine invest a staggering $1.17 billion into building trenches on its territory. Ukraine had to do this to counter Russia's evolving tactics. Putin's forces now utilize smaller assault units backed by drones, which has forced a rethink in the long and linear trenches we spoke about earlier. The $1 billion has been used to build around 3,000 defensive points, all of which are smaller trenches, in areas that are either under active assault or that Ukraine believes will come under attack soon. So we see that Ukraine's trenches are effective for defending against Russia's advances, but how is Russia responding? We mentioned earlier that Putin is trying to bring Russia's manpower advantage to bear against Ukraine. Though he's using smaller assault groups, there's no decrease in overall volume when it comes to the number of soldiers he's using. The difference is that those soldiers are attacking in smaller and more numerous waves, rather than in the large units Putin has used to attack Ukraine's forces before. However, Putin knows that this alone won't be enough to counter Ukraine's trench tactics. That's why he's doing something else, something very illegal. He's using chemical weapons on Ukraine's soldiers in the trenches. On July 4th, CBS News wrote about reports made by both the Dutch and German military intelligence services. Both say that Russia has started to increase its use of chemical weapons in Ukraine, which includes the use of a poison gas named chloropicrin. If that gas sounds familiar, it's because it's the very same one that soldiers used against each other during World War I. It seems that Putin's logic is to counter Ukraine's World War I-era tactics with a strategy pulled from the same war. The problem is that trenches are still legal in modern warfare. Chemical weapons aren't. Dutch Defense Minister Ruben Brekelmans explained the problem in an X-post on July 4th. Drones are dropping the chemical chloropicrin on trenches, driving away and then killing Ukrainian soldiers. Brekelmans went on to say that this is yet another example of Russia showing its evil face, before adding that Putin seems to be purposefully trying to lower the threshold for chemical weapons usage, which is not only dangerous for Ukraine, but also for the rest of Europe and the world. This really is significant, De Breton Gordon tells Times Radio when speaking about the Dutch and German findings. The Dutch security services, who I think are behind collecting this evidence, are really talking about thousands and thousands of uses of CS gas and also chloropicrin. De Breton Gordon notes that Ukraine has been claiming Russia is using these types of gases for many months now, and has put several reports into the United Nations Watchdog, the organization for the prohibition of chemical weapons. However, the Dutch and Germans making the same claims adds more weight. This is no longer just a country under constant attack that's accusing Russia of using chemical weapons. It's several countries who aren't fighting Russia making the claims, with evidence to back them up. There are two big reasons why Russia's chemical-based approach to Ukraine's trench tactics is such big news. First, the terrible effects of the chemicals Russia is using can't go unnoticed, as Attrition Gordon explains. If you can imagine you're in a trench and this stuff gets lobbed into you as you're spluttering, trying to get out of the way, he says. The Russians are then following up, and as soon as you get out of the trench, their standard operating procedure seems to be to drop a hell of a lot of artillery just after they've dropped the gas, and also quite a lot of direct fire. It's a very effective counter-tactic. Russia is using gas to smoke Ukrainian soldiers out of their trenches before raining artillery shells and gunfire upon them. But that brings us to the second reason why this Russian response to Ukraine's trench tactics is so important. It's illegal, and Putin knows it. As CBS points out, Russia is a signatory of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which bans the use of the very gases the Netherlands and Germany say Russia is using against Ukraine. Russia was also a signatory of the Geneva Protocol, which was created in the wake of World War I to ban the use of chemical weapons that caused so many deaths during that war. Russia hasn't withdrawn from any of these conventions. Instead, it's using chemical weapons to counter Ukraine's trench tactics while being an active signatory and denying everything that it's doing. This isn't a new tactic for Russia. Way back in March 2022, mere weeks after Putin launched his full-scale invasion, Vox Ukraine wrote about how Russia was already breaking the Geneva Conventions, to which it is also a signatory. It said Russia had broken several articles of that convention, including Articles 32, 51, and 52, all of which relate to the protection of civilians during war. Those articles seem to mean nothing to Russia. As of May 31st, Russia has killed 13,341 Ukrainian civilians and injured 32,744. It also regularly launches drone and missile strikes against Ukraine's cities, all under the guise of attacking military targets, when the reality is that Russia is trying to create terror in Ukraine's cities. So Putin's chemical response to Ukraine's trench tactics shouldn't be a surprise. He'd already shown he was willing to break international law to get what he wanted. Putin is just doing it again to deal with Ukraine's trenches. But even with all of this, Russia still hasn't come up with an adequate counter to Ukraine's trenches. That's why it's losing so many of its soldiers. It's also why the Ukraine war has settled into a pattern in which Russia is gaining territory only to lose it almost immediately. Attrition Gordon explains. He describes what's happening in Ukraine as the classic type of warfare, before adding, the Russians might gain a trench and then half an hour later they lose it again because the gas has gone. That's Putin's problem. Even when he's breaking every international law related to warfare that's in the book, Ukraine is still managing to hold his soldiers off. And that brings us to what Ukraine's trench tactics mean for the war both now and in the future. First, there's the manpower churn. We mentioned earlier that Putin is relying on attritional tactics to overcome Ukraine's trenches, and that these tactics are costing him over 1,100 soldiers per day. On June 12th, Russia's total casualty rate broached 1 million, and it's only been getting higher since. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Russia has lost 1,028,610 soldiers as of July 8th. The situation is bad for Putin. So bad that he's gone running back to North Korea to help him maintain his attritional strategy. On July 2nd, CNN reported that North Korea is preparing to send between 25,000 and 30,000 soldiers, who are likely to arrive in Russia in the coming months. That's around 3 times the number of soldiers it sent toward the end of 2024, who Putin used to help him push Ukraine out of the Kursk Oblast. Will those soldiers stay in Russia to serve as a defensive force, or does Putin intend to sacrifice them to Ukraine's trenches as he tries to advance deeper into the country? Either way, this shows us that Russia has no intention of changing its attritional strategy, even as thousands of its soldiers continue to die thanks to Ukraine's World War I-inspired approach. Putin will just send more into the meat grinder. The attrition doesn't stop. As important here are the lessons that Europe, specifically the continent's NATO members, need to take away from Ukraine's tactic and its war against Russia as a whole. The most important of those lessons is that cyber isn't some sort of holy grail that can deliver a knockout blow to an opposing force. It's important, of course, as Ukraine has demonstrated with its drone and electronic warfare innovations. But Putin learned this lesson early into his invasion. He believed his combination of cyber tactics and steamrolling Ukraine would be enough to have his war over and done with within a matter of days. It wasn't. Cyber alone can't defeat a country, especially not one that's determined to wage a war of attrition while relying on its manpower advantages. The West needs to take note. After all, NATO doctrine focuses on the concept of maneuver warfare. Under this doctrine, NATO would use a combination of movement, surprise, and initiative to achieve victory over an opponent. The concept is far from irrelevant, even given the war that's raging in Ukraine. All of these tactics are vital to achieving victory, but what the West has to learn from Ukraine's trench tactics and Russia's attritional strategy is that maneuver warfare alone won't be enough to win a war against a nation that has a leader who's willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of his soldiers. Many in the West have already woken up to that fact. That's particularly the case for European countries, against which Russia could utilize the same ground-based tactics it's using in Ukraine. In January 2024, the UK Defence Journal wrote that Estonia and France were teaming up to work through some trench warfare exercises together. That training was organised by soldiers from France's 1st Parachute Chasseurs Regiment, who arrived in Estonia in September 2023 to take part in the exercise. In the UK, Business Insider says similar training is taking place to prepare the country's troops for trench warfare against Russia. Spain is also holding similar training exercises. Its Galicia Brigade took part in a trench warfare exercise alongside troops from Slovakia in February 2025. What we have here is a strange case of modern military nations being forced to adapt so that they're ready to use tactics that have been seen as outdated for decades. Trench warfare was thought to be a relic of World War I, an irrelevant approach in the wake of nations switching to building stronger air forces and more mobile ground units. If the Ukraine war has shown us anything, it's that trenches still play a key role in an attritional campaign. They have to against Russia, which is mired in older tactics and is willing to sacrifice its soldiers to get its way. Ukraine has innovated new ways to use its trenches with drones and its smaller strongpoints. These innovations may prove vital if Russia turns its attention beyond Ukraine and toward the rest of Europe. And Ukraine isn't the only country that's using the tools of World War I to fight against Russia. Just a couple of days ago, news broke that Germany is planning to spend big on 3,500 tanks and armored vehicles in preparation for a fight against Russia. Find out more about the move that will make Germany unstoppable on the ground in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you, as always, for watching.